Right. This is the book which I'm discussing tonight, and it was published by the Analecta Carthusiana. We have this wonderful, or had, James Hogg, who had been a Carthusian monk and then married and became a professor at the University of Salzburg. And he has always gathered up the scholars. Okay, Angela's coming in, and helped them publishing their work and so forth. And he's published several of my books, and I'm very grateful to him for that. And this book I put together with an Italian colleague, Gabriella Del Lungo. She and I discovered each other that I was working with Julian of Norwich here in Florence, and she was working with Marjorie Kemp here in Florence. And these are two women in the 14th century who actually met each other. And Marjorie writes, although she's illiterate, she writes about this this meeting. Alex, welcome. So we've now got Boston, Iceland, Canada, and so forth. Philadelphia, we're tonight pretty widespread, and I'm so grateful to you all for joining us. So in the book, which sort of spans all over Europe, and I'm going to try to advance to the next. Right, Alex. It's always resists advancing at the beginning. This is the cover and the introductory page. Mary's Dowry. I first heard about Mary's Dowry when I went to Kilcullen, County Kildare, to stay with Sister Anna Maria Reynolds. She's Cross and Passion nun, Catholic, and I was then Anglican nun in Sussex. And they welcomed me. They were wonderful to me. And Sister Marina, who used to dye her hair red, she was a splendid sister who the farmhands all put their earnings together to give her her dowry so she could enter the convent because her father was too poor for her to enter. And she was telling me that England is Mary's dowry, and the dowry has to come back to the bride if things go wrong. Henry VIII divorced and executed his wives, and they lost their dowries. England became Anglican instead of Catholic. So I've used this title, and I will explain also how in the gospel, Mary treasures all of these things in her heart. It's not money, it's things of the spirit that she treasures. So what we did was to do this parallel text. And I love doing that. I've enjoyed sort of setting up books. And I found that you could do merge with PDFs and arrange to have the parallel text in the two different languages. I've always typeset my books. So this is the anthology of pilgrimage and contemplative writings. And we go through the precursors and then the pilgrims. Most of them are women, and then the continental contemplatives and how they mesh with those in England. There's a sacred conversation which takes place all over Europe and as far as Iceland. And when we get to Phil Rowton discussing Iceland, we can also mention Guthritha, who gives birth to the first European on the American continent in the year 1000. And then we will discuss the exile contemplatives after Henry VIII and Elizabeth I banish this mode of contemplative thought and so forth. And they have to, the nuns especially, go into exile on the continent to preserve the contemplative writings that they had had from the Middle Ages. So the precursors. And I love the story in the Old Testament, time of King Josiah, when they've decided to clean up the temple. And in doing so, as we know, when we spring clean, we find treasures that we'd forgotten about. They discover the Torah in a cupboard. And they're very worried about this. And they go to Huldah. She's a woman, she's a prophetess. And they ask her what to do. And she says, it's too late. You haven't been paying attention to it. And you will be going into the Babylonian exile as slaves. But you must now read it aloud to all the people, the children, the women, and the men. And this way they will learn the Bible. And this story is recalled by St. Jerome when he speaks about St. Paul, St. Paula and Eustacia, mother and daughter, and also by Abbess Hulda, because her name corresponds with Hulda, Hilda, and also by the Franciscan speaking of Angela da Foligno, and by the hermit Alfonso Jaen speaking of St. Birgitta of Sweden. So there was this sense of women preserving the Bible. And in this early catacomb painting, we see Veneranda accompanied by Saint Petronilla, who was St. Peter, frescoed in a catacomb in Rome in 356. And here she has the capsa full of scrolls. And okay, we need to go back. And above it, she has a codex. It's, yeah. And then we also have another book cupboard with all of the books of the Bible again. Well, these are the four Gospels in the tomb of Galla Placidia. And again, this is a woman's tomb and shows how important it was for women, the preservation of the gospel for women and slaves. And here we see three of these cupboards. We've already had the capsa of Veneranda. Now we have here the one for Galla Placidia. Then in Northumbria, we have Ezra with the cupboard with all of the biblical books. And then this is the cupboard in Monte Amiata, where this huge codex of the Bible was brought by Chilfrith from Northumbria to give to the Pope, and it ended up here in Tuscany in a rather volcanic region. And here I wanted to talk about Mary as extremely important in the gospel. Often the male priests say Mary is wonderful because she is silent. She is not silent. She, pregnant, unwed still, goes to her cousin who's of the priestly caste. She isn't, she's lay, and they're both pregnant. She's young and Elizabeth is old. But there she is celebrating the fact that she is pregnant with the Magnificat. My soul doth magnify the Lord. And it's such a Marxist text. It's all about, the rich shall be sent empty away and so forth and so on. And what's fascinating is that Luca della Robbia, his most beautiful work is this. And this story is told in the Gospel of Luke. So here you have the artist whose name, Luke, goes back to the story that Luke is the one who does the portrait of Mary and helps, learns from her the story that he writes into the Gospel. And then we have Helena, and her story is in the legends that she was a British slave, and the father of her child repudiates her, the Emperor Constans. But Constantine, her son, then when he becomes emperor at York, proclaims her as Empress of the Roman Empire. And she is probably the one who Christianizes her son. And you will later have the Empress Irene in 787 and the Empress Theodora in 843, going back to the use of the icons of the mother and child, which is the feminine image, which the previous emperors, in their desire to have the Arabs in their armies, had become iconoclasts and had forbidden the icons. And we see in the iconography of Mary and Jesus in this period, this is my own icon, but earlier ones really are showing Helena and Constantine, both of them in Roman togas, as empress and emperor, as Mary and Jesus. So it is the Magnificat world upside down of Christianity as religion of women and slaves. Monica and Augustine. Monica is copying Helena. Helena had given this splendid model to the Roman Empire of an empress who insisted on working for the poor, rescuing those who were enslaved in salt mines, dressing very humbly, establishing churches, doing everything she could to live the gospel. And then Augustine, who rebels against his mother, uh, encounters Ambrose in Milan, where Ambrose's music, Deus Creator Omnium, becomes this wonderful text that he will use in the confessions about time and so forth. I love teaching that text to students. And the other cluster is Jerome, Paula, and Eustachium. Paula and Eustachium always get forgotten now, but they were remembered in the past. Without them, without their learning Hebrew, they already had Greek and Latin. They were Jerome's secretaries. They were also helping him with the translation, and they were funding the entire project, living themselves in poverty, although they were very wealthy before, in a cave in Bethlehem, the word where the word became flesh. And then I've also put into the book Arsenius, because he's a desert father who keeps showing up in many of the later texts. And he's always talking about the need to be silent. So the men talk about the need to be silent, but in this gathering of texts, it's the women who find they have voices, and they are the ones who will be carrying on the Christian traditions. And then we also have Boethius, who is learning from the woman figure Philosophia, and Gregory on Benedict and Scholastica. I love the chapter where Scholastica persuades Benedict to break his rule and to stay overnight, which is not allowed. And by praying to God, then a thunderstorm comes and he can't leave to climb up the mountain of Subiaco. And the next day she dies. They were twins. So that story is told, it's sung by the monks on their birthday because they were twins. And then we also have Pseudo Dionysius, who is very much adopted by the male hierarchies because they like the idea of hierarchies, while the women, except for Marguerite Porete, tend to resist him. This is Andrea del Castagno. I see this painting every morning at Mass. I sit beside it. It's his painting of the saints Eustachium, Jerome, and Paula. And I love the Salvador Dali foreshortened figure of Christ on the cross. I'm hoping that someday they will clean it. It's become very faded. And then this is by Botticini. This is part of the Hieronymite order founded to honor St. Jerome by the brother of Alphonse of Jaen, who was the companion, the director of Birgitta of Sweden. And what's fascinating here is they're playing off the story of Jerome and Paula and Eustachium, but also with Eusebius, who writes the life of Constantine and Helena, and Pope Damasus, who is contemporary with Jerome. But this is in the Renaissance, and Eustachium is not only Eustachium, she's also Catherine of Sweden, St. Birgitta's daughter, and Paula is St. Birgitta, who again were doing this work of translating the Bible into a language that was comprehensible, like the Vulgate. Um, Birgitta of Sweden has the Bible translated by Master Matthias in Sweden into Swedish. And then she works on this imaging of herself as Paula with Jerome and so forth. And in the bottom, you see the two donor portraits of Girolamo Rucellai. This is the family that does the wonderful dyes with the iris bulbs in Florence of silk, and his son, and the Fiesole landscape just behind the crucifix. So we're collapsing time. And these games of time and space are very important in this discussion. And even Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, she is a Hieronymite nun in Mexico City. Eventually they take away all of her books and she dies, but she was absolutely brilliant. And this centering on the cave, Helena decided that this was the place of the birth of Christ. And then you have Paula and Eustachium living there, working with Jerome right in situ, where the word became flesh. They are taking the flesh becoming word in the book. And then Birgitta visits it, and then later even Marjorie Kemp visits it, and then even later I did. So I did all of the pilgrimages that these women did in order to research them. And this is my photograph of the Palestinian Christian family who brought their baby daughter to the birthplace in the grotto. The star is behind them. And it's not a very good photograph, I'm afraid, but it was absolutely a magical moment. And the two priests were also with me on Mount Sinai. They are from Mexico. Then Pseudo Dionysius, this is a manuscript which was actually owned by Adam Easton, who was probably Julian of Norwich's spiritual director. And she will mention Pseudo Dionysius, but will rebel against his hierarchies. This is this wonderful invocation to the Trinity, which the Cloud of Unknowing author will translate. Now, to go back to more to Ireland, St. Patrick's Lorica, Christ above me, Christ beneath me, Christ beside me, Christ within me. In every stranger I meet is Christ, and I bind unto myself this day the strong name of the Trinity. I used to sing this even in the dark, going to Mass in the winters, walking to Fiesole. And not only is it St. Patrick, but it's also St. Bridget. And I don't know if this is going to work. It's may have a problem here, but this is a wonderful painting by a Scottish artist in the last century. And that's maybe, there it is. Let's see if it'll come up. This is St. Bridget being carried by two angels to Bethlehem, and her hair is streaming down here, and the robes have all of these wonderful garments. Now, see if I can get rid of that and go back to my, yes, it worked. The Irish had the sense of the red, blue, and white martyrdoms. There were no martyrdoms happening in Ireland because it was already happily Christian. So they didn't have the red martyrdom of the bloodshed. Instead, you had the blue of staying at home and praying the offices, or the white martyrdom of going off into exile as a pilgrim. And that way, the Irish monks were found in Switzerland, in Italy, establishing Christianity. So in a sense, the center collapsed And it was the periphery that brought back the civilization of Rome back to it. And I love the Celtic Carmina Gardelica. Their website is no longer active, but you can still find it in sacred texts. And there's also a very fine, if you go to, excuse me, you can buy a 10 euro copy of the Carmina Gardelica in a beautiful edition. It has the Gaelic prayers, both in English and in Gaelic, and they're very Jewish prayers. You pray in thanksgiving to God for everything that has been created. Your bed that you lie on, the loom that you weave on, the boat that you fish in, and so forth. You offer a prayer to Jesus, Mary, and Bridget, and so on. And these prayers were collected, their songs were collected by Alexander Carmichael right at the beginning of the last century, going to the islands of Scotland. And they're well worth reading, they're absolutely beautiful. But that is the Celtic world. And the British Isles then had the invasion of the Anglo-Saxons, who learned their Christianity from the Irish and from the Celts. And one of their texts is, I love it, is The Dream of the Rood. And it's a missionary cross that they set up in Scotland from Northumbria with the various scenes, which are also pilgrimage sites in the Holy Land, as well as of the Desert Fathers, of Mary Magdalene washing the feet of Christ with her hair, and so forth. And also the inhabited vine, that is from Ravenna, that's from Boethius's part of the world, as well as having Pictish and Celtic intertwines. So you get this culture clash on this one stone monument. You get Latin words, and you also get the poem in runes. And remember that the runes came from Phoenicia, Sarah Phoenicia, to the Etruscans along the trade routes all the way up to Iceland. And when Phil had me come to Iceland, I saw on the computer keyboard in the Arnie Magnusson Institute the letters Thorn and Yoch and so forth, the runic letters, which still got used for quite some time, even in medieval English letters. And these are again the inhabited vine. And then this is the manuscript that made its way all the way to Vercelli in Italy of this poem in Old English, and that had already been written in runes on the cross. And I have that poem in the book, in Mary's Dowry, because it is where the cross dreams that the scene of the crucifixion on himself, and it's told from his perspective. Then we have the English mission to the continent. Later on, you will have the continental mission to England by the exiled nuns. But here, Boniface invites the Anglo-Saxon nuns to come to Germany. One of them is Leoba, and she has this vision of this ball of purple thread that comes from her mouth and so forth. And her story gets into this book. And now we turn to the pilgrims. And this was my first pilgrimage map where I was trying to plot where these various people went, including Guthritha, who goes from Iceland to Newfoundland, and then to Rome, and then back to Iceland, and so forth. And I also recently found this map of Irish shipping. Remember that the earliest genetic findings in Ireland are that the original inhabitants were blue-eyed and black from Africa and so forth. So you can see here how easy it was to reach Ireland from Africa, from Spain, and so forth. We speak about the Black Irish. The two forms are very blonde, fair, red-haired, or so the dark. And also you can see how these migrations happened genetically and linguistically and so forth. And along with them, religious cultures. Iceland continued to be pagan until the year 1000. Phil invited me to Reykjavik in the year 2000 uh, when they were celebrating 1000 years of Christianity. And I used this map from Google because I couldn't find a map that showed Iceland and America and the Mediterranean and the Black Sea and so forth. So from that, I could draw this one. And we have this area here with Constantinople and Jerusalem and Bethlehem. Egeria journeys all over that part. She comes from probably from Spain and so forth. And then we have this energy here, Sweden, Iceland, and so forth. Birgitta will come down to Rome. You will have earlier pilgrims also making their way, like Pega, who is Guthlac's sister from East Anglia, the Cambridgeshire Fens, and so forth. And what the story that I love is Margaret of Jerusalem, who's, when you went on pilgrimage, you were not meant to indulge in sex. Her parents went on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and she was born in Jerusalem from Beverley in the northern part of England. And they then journeyed back, and then she decided she must go back to her birthplace. So she travels all the way from Beverley to Jerusalem, and she ends up in the siege of Jerusalem fighting with a cook pot on her head, carrying the stones to defend the city from the Muslims and so on. And her brother, on her way back again in France, she meets with her brother, by then a monk, and he writes her whole story in Latin. And I think our translation and the Latin text that we put into this book, it really does deserve to be known because it's a wonderful story. And there's a wonderful moment where a Muslim steals her breviary from her, and she's weeping, and he gives it back. And you get the sense of the open-mindedness of people, the kindness that can happen. And then we have Birgitta of Sweden and Marjorie Kemp and Alice of Bath. And then I did all of their pilgrimages, but the year before I entered my convent. And these are my photographs. This is of St. Catherine's Monastery and Mount Sinai. And we climbed up the mountain early in the morning in the dark to see dawn at the top. And this is my photograph of dawn. And this is the mass we celebrated with the two priests from Mexico and the bishop from Spain, all of us together. And on the mountain with us were also Egyptian Muslim family, all in their sacred green, because this was also a sacred place in the Quran for Moses, and with young adolescents being very friendly with us, all of us feeling this splendid magic of, not magic, but the marvelous of this mountain. The Jews know we've got the wrong mountain. It was Helena who decided this was the mountain of St. Catherine and so on and so forth. But Islam and Christianity share it. And there were a group of elderly Greek ladies. Their leader was named Dionysia, all of them with pilgrim staffs climbing up the mountain like mountain goats and so on. We were a wonderful motley crew. And then these are Victorian pictures of St. Catherine's Monastery and the path. And I took these photographs. The reason why I went was because I knew that Mount Sinai was used by Dante for Mount Purgatory. And you have these arches, which in the ancient times, the monks would hear the priest's confessions, and they were called, these monks who would hear the confessions, angelos, angels. And you had the angels in Dante's Purgatory who wipe away each one of the 7 P's and so forth. It's fascinating where you get these tangible places and then the literary texts and so forth, these memories playing games with time and space. And then this is a manuscript in the Laurentian Library by St. Donatus, who was an Irish pilgrim who showed up in Fiesole when they were about to elect their bishop. And they elected him. And he was a great scholar, and he wrote this poem about St. Bridget hanging her wet cloak in the rainstorm on a sunbeam to dry. And I read this huge manuscript in the Laurentian Library. It's so big, you can't read it sitting down. You actually have to stand to look at it properly. Written out in the Mugello before the Renaissance. And then Phil, can you chime in now, Phil? This is your photograph of me at the old thing. Can you unmute yourself, Phil?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Oh, yeah.
Can you tell us about this book?
This must. I'm not sure which book that is right there.
I think that's the one that's got the Egil saga in it. It's the grey thing, the grey one.
Book, maybe.
Right. And then this one is
with Eric's.
okay.
I'll have to look that up. Sorry.
Right, I may be wrong. I should have done my homework. But I love this. This is an Icelandic Crusader map. And this is extraordinary because the buildings in Jerusalem have snow roofs, which of course they don't have. They have flat roofs. They don't need to ward off the snow. But the architecture is Scandinavian for a Mediterranean city. But apart from that, the buildings are in the right places. And then here you've got Asia, Africa, and Europe. And then it says on the other side, without people. They know the world is round. And they don't know about the presence in this map of America, but they know that the sea is on the other side of the landmass. And this is where, at the old thing, they unanimously voted in the year 1000 to become Christian. And the Thingvellir. It was, I can't tell you, Phil, how marvelous it was to come to Iceland, and thank you so much. And then this, you can talk about this one.
Sure, yeah.
Yes.
Actually, Svanhildur Óskarsdóttir, she's the expert on the Stuart manuscript, so yeah.
Yes.
The Old Testament in it, yeah.
And for a woman's convent.
Stuart, hold on one second.
Yeah.
Where am I?
What's lovely about the iconography here is you've got the ram caught in the tree branches, the angel with the sword stopping the sacrificing of Isaac just in the nick of time. It's a really scary moment, but it's beautifully illustrated. And this goes back, as you taught me, Phil, that the Icelandic priests went to the Victorines in Paris to study their theology. So this is why you get French style manuscript in distant Iceland. And again, thank you. And then we've discuss these people, Margaret of Jerusalem, Isolde Parawastel. She goes to the Pope and she says, please let me build a chantry because I got beaten up by the Muslims during the siege of Jerusalem. And he says to her, you can't build a full chantry, you can just have a chantry chapel in a church. She's a bit miffed about that. And she was hung upside down, she says. And then you have Birgitta and Catherine of Sweden. And this is from Finland, of the Bishop Hemming and St. Birgitta. I've often copied this. I love the painting of her writing the book. And then she again goes to the cave in Bethlehem. And this is Birgitta in her widow's garb. And this is Mary she sees Mary, she places herself collapsing time into the moment of a nativity in the cave. And she describes, she's already had children herself. She describes Mary giving birth to the child, laying him on the ground naked with the 2 pieces of white linen that she has made for him to dress him in. And Joseph is coming back with the light when he finds that he doesn't need it because the light has come into the world. But this grotto is what the grotto is like. They are not imagining it, they are remembering it. And that painting was actually commissioned by the daughter of one of the people who accompanied Birgitta on that pilgrimage. Now we turn to the contemplative, continental contemplatives, beginning with Hildegard of Bingen. Her last work, the Liber Divinorum, is wonderful. It's very much about ecology. Its manuscript was made after she died, according to the copy that she had created. And it's now in Lucca, next city to ours. And here you see Birgitta writing it in the corner. See if I can get the arrow to show her. As she is here writing it on wax tablets, Bolmer the scribe is writing it down on parchment, and she's accompanied by Richardis, her great friend, whom she will cause her to die, unfortunately. She's a bit, Hildegard's character I don't really like, but she's brilliant. And this is this wonderful account of how if the earth is looked after well, it will be productive. But if it is treated badly, immorally, it will become sick and there will be epidemics and so forth, and climate change and so on. She's very up to date. Mechtild of Hackabun wrote the Liber Specialis Gratiae, which has often been copied out in England. I wish that instead we'd had more access to Mechtild of Magdeburg, whose writings are wonderful. She describes seeing Mary with her poems written on her mantle and so on. And she describes going to Mass and giving the Mass penny, and the Mass penny has the head of Christ on it and so forth. Angela of Foligno is the woman whom Thomas Merton said she's the wild mystic. She's great. She was saying that priests needed to study Greek and Hebrew and so on and so forth. Marguerite Porete writes the book on the, it's a very pseudo-Dionysian text. It's a wonderful text. The bishops got so upset about it and the scholars at the Sorbonne that it was burned in her presence in Valenciennes, and then she was burned at the Sorbonne in 1310. And contemporary with Umiltà da Faenza is Dante Alighieri. And I see the conclusion of his poem, the Commedia, as definitely a contemplative text of the highest order. And St. Umiltà Faenza, she dies in 1310, like Marguerite Porete. She comes from Faenza to Florence, so she's here when Dante is here. And her disciple has the Lorenzetti paint the stories of her life. She's illiterate, and they tease her by making her read in the refectory. And she reads the most wonderful theology. It's not in the book. She's made it up, or the Spirit has given it to her. And then she dictates splendid sermons. I left her out of this book because she wasn't known about in England, but I couldn't resist putting her into this talk, and I named my website after her. The Friends of God were a splendid movement amongst the Dominicans against the rigidity of the Inquisitions. They were like influenced by Marguerite Porete. Meister Eckhart, most of his works were lost. John Towler, but the two whose writings get to England are in the same manuscript as Julian of Norwich in the Amherst are Henry Suso and Jan van Ruysbroek. And this is the library which owns the major Suso manuscript and also Mechtil von Magdeburg at Einsiedeln. Einsiedeln is an abbey in Switzerland near Zurich, which was founded by an Irish monk, and it's fascinating because the cell of the monk is at the center of the great church. And then within the cell is a Black Madonna that shows up in the 12th century. The Irish monk St. Meinrad had been there centuries earlier, but you get this collapsing of cultures together. And festooned all around this huge building are all of these ex voto paintings of the miracles that have been done, broken legs that have restored themselves, and so on and so forth. Absolutely fascinating in a rather primitive style. And here we see the monk who is the librarian, Father Odo Lang, who gave me this photograph. And this is the miniature in the Henry Suso autograph manuscript. I've just reviewed a book on Richard Methley. Barbara Newman, in her notes, says that Henry Suso's figure of wisdom is a woman. But this figure of wisdom isn't a woman. He's got a beard. It's Jesus as wisdom, as is also Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. And under his cloak, Henry Suso and Elspeth Stargel. Elspeth Stargel at this point is already dead, but she's the one who encouraged Henry Suso, who began his life as a rather disturbed person who was carving the name of Jesus on his chest and so forth. And she turned him into a wonderful writer. And this was the Computer of Wisdom, the Horologium Sapientiae, based on Boethius, which was read and translated all over Europe. And here you see the Swiss technology of the clocks going on. He is Swiss. And then Birgitta of Sweden, Catherine of Siena, we put their texts into this. We've already had Birgitta describing her pilgrimages the year before she died to Jerusalem. But here we see the kind of visionary experience that they sought. This painting is in Bruges, in the hospital of St. John the Evangelist. And here you see St. John having his vision of the apocalypse with the four horsemen and so forth, and the priest at Mass. And then you get Birgitta, feminine version of the same vision. She is writing at her desk in Rome her revelations, and Mary and Jesus send down their words to her. And here you see all the heavenly hierarchies, the angels and so forth, and the priests celebrating Mass. And this is in one of her manuscripts, illuminated for Alfonso of Jaén, who's her spiritual director. And then she influences Catherine of Siena. And at her death, Alfonso of Jaen is given to Catherine of Siena to be her spiritual director, at which point immediately Catherine of Siena writes letters to all of the heads of state of Europe, to emperors and popes and so on and so forth, and to condottieri like Sir John Hawkwood and so on. And then this is her text published in Zion Abbey in Middle English with the engraving of her at this wonderful Orchard of Zion, which plays both with Catherine and with Brigittine theology. Now the English contemplatives. I especially love this manuscript. It's the St. Alban's Psalter. And here we see Mary Magdalene telling the disciples the good news. She is the first to tell them that. And Jerome had already said to Paula, remember, it was a woman who first gave the good news. And then Abelard says this also to Eloise, and so on. Christina of Markite, her story is written in Latin. Recently, the Middle English scholars have been talking about vernacular theology and putting it into a box. But really, there was always this crossing over between Latin and English. English so that ordinary people who didn't have a university education could share in this material democratically. At the same time, using Latin so it could be spread all over Christendom, because that was the common lingua franca for theology. And then we have Richard Raleigh, who is this wonderful, enthusiastic hermit. Nicholas Watson disparaged him, saying he wasn't authorized. That was the whole point about being a desert monk or hermit. The more you wanted to be authorized, the more suspicious one should be of such a person. It was the one who was really on the margins who could be the prophetic voice. And Richard Rowley, I just went off into the countryside, wrote wonderful things. He abandoned his university career and so on and so forth. And his writings are lovely, and they get into this text, and they will be picked up again by Richard Methley. John Whiteridge, on the island of Farne, off Lindisfarne, writes the most beautiful Latin texts of contemplation, which David Farmer, who was a Benedictine monk, translated into English. And I put both the Latin text and the English text here. And then we have William Fleet. And William Fleet was from Cambridge. He gets quoted by Julian of Norwich. He journeys to Lecceto outside of Siena, and he becomes Catherine of Siena's spiritual director. And he describes in The Remedy of Temptations how to confront these horrific visions that one can have of demons and so forth. And here we see paintings, which I use when I publish his texts on the web, from Francesca da Romana's convent in Rome, where she describes the same kind of temptations. And in this one, you get St. Onofrio, who is her patron, but really it's the evil one who's coming to her, pretending to be the saint. Meanwhile, the angel who's been given to her by her son is protecting her. And then I love this. This is from Walter Hilton, who picks up the story, which is like the Jesus prayer of the Orthodox monks. And he says over and over again in this part of the text, I am naught, I have naught I ask nor covet but the love of Jesus. And when I used to walk to Mass in the winters in the dark with the owls hooting, in the spring and the fall with the dawn chorus, I used to be saying St. Patrick's Lorica and this, because it's so lovely. And this is the actual manuscript in which he writes it. I am not, I have not, but as ne covered but the love of Jesus. And then we have Adam Easton, who owns this manuscript of Pseudo Dionysius, who I think is Julian of Norwich's spiritual director. And I think he is the Cloud of Unknowing Author. He and the Cloud of Unknowing Author share all the same materials. Usually Adam Easton is writing in Latin, but it is said when the library is lost, but before, when it was catalogued, before it was lost, that he had many treatises in the vernacular. And I think that he is a logical person for the Cloud, and that it's probably being written to Julian, who's resisting it because of its espousal of hierarchies. She says she doesn't go in for angels. This is quite extraordinary for somebody in East Anglia to say, where so many of the churches had their roofs carved with angels. And then in the book, I also have the meeting between Julian and Marjorie. Many of the men writing to the women are giving them spiritual direction, telling them not to worry about visions if they are of charity to the other. But if they're only for their own self-aggrandizement, they are from the evil one. And this is what Julian tells Marjorie when Marjorie seeks to be consoled for all of her visions that she has. And then this is the Westminster manuscript of the Showing of Love, and it's opening with the O Sapientia antiphon. And here again on the hazelnut in the palm of the hand. And I looked thereupon with the eye of my understanding, and I thought, what might this be? And it was answered generally thus: it is all that is made. And the text goes on quoting actually Gregory on Benedict, that the whole cosmos seems small because one is in the presence of its creator. And this goes back to Bridget's vision of her cloak hung on the sunbeam, to Benedict's vision described by Gregory when he's in prayer in a tower of the whole cosmos being reduced to one beam of light. This playing of space, it's sort of a bit like quantum physics and so on that's going on. And then this is the rear table for Norwich Cathedral with the scene of the crucifixion, which is playing off the execution by hanging, drawing and quartering of one of the Lollards, which gets into Julian's text, where she is describing that execution rather than the crucifixion of the body hanging in the air for many days and the flesh drying. And then Sir Miles Stapleton, this is the Book of Hours he commissioned from an Augustinian, and you can see the crucifixion with all of the blood stains like Julian describes. He had fought at Alexandria like Chaucer's knight, and he then was the executor for Isabel, Countess of Suffolk's will, leaving Julian money, so he knew her. And his daughter also became an anchoress at the Norwich Carmelite Friary. And another member of her family, Agnes Stapleton, owned another of these contemplative texts, chastising of God's children. And what's fascinating is that this family continues all the way through the nuns that will be in exile after the Reformation, along with the Gascoignes and the Moors that descended from Thomas More. And then I had also placed in this book this lovely letter by Richard Methley to Hugh Harramede. And then I got asked to review this book by translating Richard Methley's writings, and it's included at the end of it in modern English. I've given it in the Middle English from James Hogg's edition. And this is Mount Grace Priory, where Richard Methley was living, where also Marjorie Kemp's manuscript ends up. And this is what they imagined, reconstructed to be the Carthusian writer's cell. It is a perfect environment for writing. You have your meals brought to your door. You don't actually see the person bringing it because he puts it in through this and so forth. So you have no contact with the outside world apart from a few of the offices and so forth. And then the English Bridgetines, before they went into exile, they were gathering up contemplative writings, copying them out, readying them for printing, but they didn't get printed, many of them, because of the Reformation. And then they had to go into exile, and the Paris manuscript of Julian, which is in London dialect, no longer the Norwich dialect, on Flemish watermark paper, but it's Elizabethan. And then we actually have the Zion nuns showing up. They're the Bridgetine nuns with the 5 wounds of the 5 roundels on their hat with their veils. Went disguised as lay people in order to get the books published. And one of them got captured, several died in prison. Elizabeth Saunders got captured and imprisoned in Winchester Castle in 18th of November 1580, was charged with the possession of certain lewd and forbidden books, including Julian of Norwich. And this is the kind of manuscript they were writing, again setting it in rules, in lines, in order for it to be printed. And again, and all shall be well, and thou shalt see it thyself that all manner of things shall be well, and so forth. And then there was a problem because an Elizabethan pirate, Thomas Robinson, went to Zion Abbey, which by that point was in Portugal. It had left France, gone from Rouen to Lisbon, and he pretended that he was a convert. So he actually became briefly a monk. And then he absconded with a lot of their treasures. And he wrote a scurrilous book against the convent, making all kinds of calumnious claims against him. So it was no longer possible for the recusant noble families to send their daughters to Zion Abbey, founded from Birgittas, Vadstena Abbey in Sweden. So they had to found another one, Benedictine in Cambrai in France, and the young daughters that were sent out were descendants of Thomas More and Thomas Gascoigne and the Stapletons and so forth. And they were joined by Dom Augustin Baker, who in the 17th century realized that these 14th century texts were the kind of texts that these women needed, these young women. They were still really teenagers. And he was getting Robert Cotton, whose collection became the British Library, to send books to him to give to them. And there was a problem because the other monks became very jealous of the way the nuns adored Dom Augustin Baker's teachings. He never actually saw the nuns, they were so cloistered, but they revered what he was writing and saying. And they wanted to call in all of these manuscripts as containing poisonous, pernicious, and diabolical doctrine. And these are wonderful texts, which, so the nuns immediately copied out their entire library and founded a daughter house in Paris to save the lot, which they did. And these are the booklets that they were creating. This is Dame Bridget More, descended from Thomas More, copying out Dame Margaret Gascoigne, copying out Julian of Norwich, and Dame Barbara Constable doing the same. She's copying out, this manuscript now is lost, but at least we have the photocopy of it. And then they were also writing out the Sloane manuscripts, which end up in the British Library. And this is the first one, and then this is the second one, written very hurriedly, but which is copying in the 17th century Julian's 14th century Norwich dialect. I call these nuns the earliest English text society. They did a splendid job. And then 100 years later, and they write out the collections celebrating the two women who defended Dom Augustine Baker's teachings, Dame Catherine Gascoigne and Dame Gertrude Moore. And Dame Gertrude Moore actually died of smallpox in the middle of this row with the monks and the nuns, and but she was able to create this defense before she did die. And then I found this in the Mazarin Library in Paris, and the catalogue sneered at it as a work of some superstitious monk. Well, the engraving is of Dom Augustine Baker, but this is written by a nun, not a monk. And here is the text. With Fenelon, who was actually in great difficulty, but he was influenced by these writings which he found in Cambrai. And then they write out the Stowe manuscript to give to the Marchioness of Buckingham. When they return from the French Revolution, they were almost guillotined. The Carmelite nuns with them were guillotined, and they came back to England in the clothes of the dead Carmelite nuns. But already Serenus Cressy had published Julian of Norwich's Showing of Love, and they make this copy for the Marchioness. And these are my editions of the text for Sismel and for okay, this was the this was the paperback edition translation, but this one has the text exactly as it is in the Westminster manuscript, the Amherst manuscript, the Sloane manuscripts, and so forth. And then these are the books that I have been publishing around this theme. And then also I believe in typesetting the books and also creating limited edition books like the one we did on the image of God. And I feel that women need to seize the printing press. The revolution has to seize the printing press. This is what the Beguines did in Belgium, the women Beguines. And also at Little Gidding, the daughters were creating books. And it's a way for us to enter into the world of voices, to have a voice. And it has gone, it's like been like a river throughout all of Christendom's history, except the problem being that the Arabic, Greco-Arabic form of the university, which excluded women and became the exclusive place for teaching theology, has meant that women's voices were suppressed. And then another book I've worked on with Penguin is the Elizabeth Barrett Browning Aurora Leigh, which begins of writing many books, there is no end, and which has been, in a sense, what has been happening here. But I've also, with this book, which I did when I was in Boulder, equally in God's image, it got picked up by Hans Kung and mentioned the discussion in his book on Christianity, where we were noting that prior to the coming of the universities in the 12th century, which are modeled on the Crusaders' experiencing of the Muslim centers of learning as male only, prior to that, women had had equal status. And in a sense, one sees here, for instance, in Donatello, the Virgin at the Annunciation is holding the book. She is literate. Antonello da Messina has this beautiful Arab girl in Sicily reading the book at the moment that the angel, and we are the angel coming to her, announcing to her that she will be the mother of Christ. So I use the Donatello hand on the cover of women in the Middle Ages with that argument. And now I want to return to Luca della Robbia, the Visitation, this world upside down of the place where Mary's dowry, we need it back to be able to continue Christianity. It is the religion of women and slaves, and it is best done where the men and the women work together, as they did in this wonderful springtide of the Friends of God, where the men were working closely with women like Henry Sousa, with Elspeth Dargle, and so on. So now we shall end the screen sharing and we will discuss whatever we want to. And we've got Phil, we've got Laura, we've got Susan and Sue and Joanne. Alex had to leave because she stepped on her glasses and she needed to get them replaced. So she was only with us at the beginning. Welcome, and please make comments. Was it coherent?
Yes, what a wonderful summary of 1,000+ years. It was really, really interesting.
I've sort of been feeling that often what I wanted to do was a bit like Auerbach in my Mimesis or Curtius, where of Europe and European civilization, and the art collapses time, religion collapses time. It's not far away and long ago. It's meant in the monastic world, it's here and now in the liturgy. And I was trying to get that sense in this material by anthologizing these texts. And it also, at the same time, it's for language learning. We've deliberately done the translation first and then the original text, so you can play games and you can explore into the original text from the knowledge of what it means, if that makes sense. And you can also go backwards to go from what's easier to what is harder. Does that make sense, Phil? You are the great translator.
Yes, but I don't have a comment on that at the moment, sorry.
I've put it on the web in PDF because it's not commercial, it's open access. But I would love to see graduate students using this, for their language learning, and perhaps also through it recovering their faith, which is not meant to happen in universities.
Oh, dear.
It's a bit subversive, like the Magnificat. Please, comments. My voice has been too much.
Julia, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I just wanted to comment, as others have, on the comprehensiveness of this. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot. I knew very little about the part about Iceland. Also the visions of, is it Birgitte? Bridget, to me, is it Birgitte? Anyway, her vision predicting the Black Death.
Right. Yes, I didn't talk about that. Birgitte, her vision was that Christ would come as plowman and plow under Sweden with the Black Death. It's a bit like COVID. And, it happens immediately after she said it. And she journeys down from Sweden to Rome. But then you get in England, Piers Plowman, this huge poem. And Birgitte had an enormous influence on England, even my village where I grew up as a child in Breed. Birgitte's head was sculpted on the church, the gable of the church, looking out over all of the land that her convent owned. Zion Abbey became one of the richest abbey in England, with 60 nuns and 25 monks. It was like the Anglo-Saxon, it was a double monastery, both genders, but they didn't meet, they didn't get to see each other. And it was a bit like the Amish and so forth. Joanne, you have comments.
Oh, simply that I had been reading recently about the period of the 16th century, and of course the abbeys are all gone.
Yes.
And so it's really very helpful and interesting for me to read about, to hear you talk about what actually was there for that many centuries before. You know, it's a different view of England.
Yes. And it was so rich and creative. I mean, the architecture was stunning, the art, the manuscripts and so forth. And then everything got cheapened with the printing press and so forth. They lost it. Maybe I'm being romantic, but
it's a bit romantic, but you know, it has its place. It has its place.
Susan, do you have comments?
Yes, I have a comment. Unless there's another Susan in here, I don't want to interrupt. But the other comment I have is, as a psychologist, I was also very fascinated to hear the part about the Middle Ages that psychiatry and theology were looked at as one. You know, the psychiatrist, a soul doctor.
Absolutely right. Yes. And you definitely get that with Boethius's text, which influences so much following that. Once Bill had sent me a photograph of the books that he had kept from my teaching. Do you remember, with the Desert Fathers and Boethius and so forth? Boethius's text has the foolish Boethius feeling terribly sorry for himself. He's under sentence of death, and he's going to be bludgeoned to death with his eyes bursting out from bonds tied around his head. And philosophy comes in. She says, stop. You know, there's moaning and groaning. Remember that even though you've lost all of your books in their crystal and ivory bookcases, you remember them. And she describes this image of the circle in the center, which is also we find in Dante and so on, that the center is where everything is kind of a black hole, all time, all space compressed. And then the further you go out of that circle, the less you are, and sin being non-being, destruction instead of creation. And it makes sense. I think I used to find it helps students saying this. Because I think so much of our modern world doesn't have a pattern that makes sense.
Hi, it's Sue, not Susan. Yeah, I think that there might be a pattern that will evolve that we aren't seeing yet. Right now, it's a little chaotic. But I was thinking about when we went to University of Pennsylvania, when you were doing speaking at the Italian Studies program, and they took us up into the rare book room that they just redone, and we got to see some of the original texts under. That was really an interesting experience. Do you remember, Julia?
Yes, yes.
University of Pennsylvania. That was lovely. And you were talking about Phoenicians, and you know, I was like studying some genealogy. One of my grandmother is from northern Spain, and I was studying a little bit about that, the Phoenicians' influence in northern Spain. I don't have much to really contribute, but it's just interesting how you said how the inside collapsed and then the outside satellites managed to resurrect the Christianity through like the Irish monks and such. I thought that was very interesting. And once again, you really give us so much information. Thank you so much.
And
That's all.
Joanne is the authority on Carthage.
Yes, but I don't know anything about runes, I have to admit.
Right. Sarepta is where, and remember the woman of Sarepta in the gospel. But these are the Philistines, the Phoenicians, and so on and so forth. That's all Semitic. And they invent this alphabet, which then gets pirated by the Greeks and the Romans and so forth. So our Christian form is the pirated version. And the original form is the runic one, which Phil gets to see in Iceland, right? And it's extraordinary because we're talking about trade routes and books going along trade routes, alphabets going along trade routes. And what I loved was we did this big conference in 2001 on the alphabet in the Bible. This was the year when the European Union was deciding to be very Freemason and very anti-religion. And we were pointing out that all of European culture is based on really the alphabet in the Bible. And neither of them are European.
Yeah.
They've come from the outside. And how could we function without them? I mean, the Bible teaches us how to do history ever after and so forth and so on. And what was lovely was that Bernard Meehan came from Trinity College Library, which has the Book of Kells, and also the head of the British Library came. And then the British Library decided, because we'd had speakers who were Jewish scholars and Russian scholars and Spanish scholars and Greek scholars and so forth, all talking about different versions of the Bible that they had, Ogham and Lagolitic and so on and so forth. It was extraordinary. So the British Library did this wonderful exhibition called Sacred, where they brought together Islamic texts and Jewish texts and Christian texts, beautiful illuminated manuscripts and artifacts, including the triumph of the icons, that 1400 icon showing the icon of the Virgin and the Child with the Empress and her son and so on. And I got to see it I got to fly to London for one day to be at that exhibition. It was magnificent. But I think seeing how cultures enrich each other along trade routes and so forth, which is why Brexit is so silly. You don't sterilize yourself, it doesn't work. Susan Carr, could you make some comments?
Oh, you mean in addition?
Yes.
Well, let me see. I'm not sure I have anything else, Julia, other than what I've added. I didn't read all of the book. I read probably
It's not meant to be read all. It's meant to be dipped into. It's meant to be read lecture divina. You dip in.
Well, but I love to read anything, and I read about 2/3. I guess I was also interested in just the time period when it got into the Middle Ages, and
yes,
it goes to Black Death. I know the repercussions for that in the relation to religion and politics, and going back to Brigitte or however you call her. I'm wondering, sorry, after the Black Death, was she acknowledged widely for predicting that, or was she persecuted Was she?
She not only predicted the Black Death, but she also said if the Pope didn't come back from Avignon to Rome, lightning would strike the bells of St. Peter and melt them, and he would die. And it happened 8 days apart.
Oh my goodness.
No, so that was scary. I mean, nobody actually talked about that in the scholarship. But when I was doing the dateline, I realized what the dates were. There was, I mean, Jean Gerson criticized her, but she was almost immediately proclaimed saint. The
Okay.
queens of Sweden and Norway, everyone. She was hated by the French, but she was admired by the English and the Scandinavians and the Germans. There was a bit of a row about her at the Council of Constance, but it was mainly a misogynistic row. They couldn't accept her because she was a woman. But it was extraordinary because she was giving the voice to other women. You get Julian quoting her, you get Marjorie Kemp doing all of her pilgrimages, which were extraordinary. I mean, she went from Vadstena to Trondheim. I went by train and it took a day and a half. She did it on foot. You know, she went to Compostela. She went to Cyprus, to the Holy Land, to Bethlehem and Jerusalem, and so on and so forth. She went to St. Michael's in Gargano in Italy, and she did all of the pilgrimages, and then her body brought back to Sweden from Rome, spent the winter at Gdansk because the Baltic was iced over and they couldn't sail. So that's where Lech Walesa started Solidarity in her church. And I was invited twice by Pope John Paul to Rome because he was doing these big celebrations of St. Birgitta. Remember, he proclaimed her patron of Europe because of solidarity. They were able to break the Iron Curtain partly through Birgitta of Sweden. So women can have a voice in politics. She was very careful never to say things in her own voice. Everything was through Mary and Jesus telling her what to say. So she was unlike Richard Raleigh. She was authorizing herself. Women did have to do that. They did have to find channels which could be acceptable instead of denigrated. Laura, can you make some comments? Silence.
Oh, you need to unmute yourself.
Oh, I am unmuted.
She's just being pausing.
I don't, can you hear me?
Yes.
Barely.
Okay. I have
Yes.
a microphone. It's in the car. I just got home from being out of town. Julia, I always just listen to you in amazement. And you have so many different things that I don't know anything about. It's hard for me to comment. But I always learn things. So
I'm always learning things. I mean,
No.
but that's what one should do is to share learning.
what I have in my mind is not really related, but I'll say it. I'm coming from 10 days with my family in Pennsylvania, and I don't know that this is appropriate to say here, but I've begun to think that my brother, who's resistant to the idea of being vaccinated and resistant to the idea that the president is the right president and resistant to just about any idea any of the rest of us have. I've begun to think that there's actually a cult in America that encompasses about half of the population.
Ooh,
I agree. I absolutely agree, Laura.
And I feel as I listen to you, I think about what it would mean to bridge this chasm, what it would take to bridge the chasm. And you're talking about lots of other times in history where people were violently opposed to each other's ideas. And of course, we know how bloody the Reformation was in so much of England and Europe, and even in Italy. I I have too many things in my head that are in the present to draw any conclusions right now, except I listen and go, oh, so this has been happening for a long time. People have decided that the other side was so wrong they had to get rid of them. That's what I'm thinking.
Right.
Sorry, it's not very uplifting.
No, I think no, this is, I mean, the previous Academia Bessarion, we were talking about racial discrimination and so forth. This damage that we do to the other out of the way we reject the other instead of realizing our common humanity. We've needed people like Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela and so forth. And you've been talking about truth and reconciliation with Native
Yes.
American, Native peoples, and I've been seeing that as there's something that we need to do here with Roma and Italians and so forth. Iceland probably is rather free of all of this, isn't it, Phil?
I'm not sure.
Phil, what would you say from Iceland?
Well, Iceland it's not entirely free of racial prejudice, that's for sure. It tends to look upon what's going on in the United States and sort of shake its head because it doesn't understand this implosion, because it's like, what are they doing? What are they thinking over there? But I mean, when you look at it, yeah, I don't know. It's hard to say what. Yeah, for myself, I was reading a lot of the letters of John Greenleaf Whittier, and I just remember that in one of his exhortations to the abolitionist society in England, he said something like, he quoted scripture and he said, raise your banner and let the banner over you be love.
Yeah.
And everything in your work for the abolitionist society. So let the banner over you be love. And I just think that there has to be this. I think a lot of what Julia brings through her exposition of the old literature is the beauty that was in all of it.
Yes.
And the beauty of the other and the beauty of the periphery and the recognition of that celebration of beauty of the outside coming to the inside and vice versa. And I think that's what somehow in America that's missing, that sort of recognition of the beauty, the sort of poetry of America. I don't know, it got lost. But I think that's, and also Julie used to teach Augustine, and I always remember that Augustine was asked, how do we know if our interpretation of scripture is correct? And he said, if it extends the kingdom of love in the world. And that's just like with what Julia told us about. We know if our visions are correct and not from the devil. If they're about extending yourself to the other.
That's
and
right. Yes.
I think that's something that needs to be somehow worked back into society, not just in America, but all across the world,
Yes.
this
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
celebration of each other and this extension of the kingdom of love in the world, actually. So, and it has to be done through, understanding and I don't know. It's there's
Well,
so
may I say that what I think Julia has done is remind us that these ideas have been with us for all these centuries. They don't get lost, no matter how negative we can sometimes feel about what we see in front of us. So,
Yes.
Julia, I'm going to have to leave. I'm
we are
abandoning my family for lunch, so I must go. But this has been wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, all of you. And I'm so grateful, especially Phil. I can't thank you enough. And Laura, because you're the one who taught me how to do the Zoom and so forth.
Phil, and can you hear me? Because I'm
Yes.
Julia, can you hear me? Because it says I'm on safe driving mode. I'm not driving. It was interesting because my father used to say a quote, and I researched it, and it is said to be from Voltaire, but now it is supposedly, I think it's what Phil was saying, Americans used to feel this way. I disagree what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it.
Right.
Yes. That used to be an American credo, and it somehow disappeared. But when I looked it up, it actually says it was not from Voltaire, the 18th century philosopher, but was a paraphrase from a biographer named Evelyn Beatrice Hall of what she thought Voltaire was thinking. So who knows? But a woman was involved, so that's all I can say. But I wish we could get back to that kind of thinking where we realize that, this is what we're fighting for our ability to disagree.
Yes. Open.
That's it.
Thank you, all of you, and good night and a happy new
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao.
Thank you, Julia.
Yes.
Goodbye. Thank you again.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. Bye.